The medieval world. Well, the people of the Middle Ages thought of the world in which they happened to live. Dates are a very useful invention. We could not do without them, but unless we are very careful, they will play tricks with us. They are apt to make history too precise. For example, when I talk the point of view of a medieval man, I do not mean that of the 31st of December of the year 476. Suddenly, all the people of Europe said, "Ah, now the Roman Empire has come to an end, and we are living in the Middle Ages. How interesting." You could have found men at the Frankish court of Charlemagne who were Romans in their habitats, in their manners, and their outlook upon life. On the other hand, when you grow up, you will discover that some of the people in this world have never passed beyond the stage of a caveman. All times and all ages overlap, and the ideas of succeeding generations play tag with each other. But it is impossible to study the minds of a good many true representatives of the Middle Ages, and then give you an idea of the average man's attitude toward life and the many difficult problems of living. First of all, remember that the people of the Middle Ages never thought of themselves as freeborn citizens who would come and go at will and shape their fate according to their ability or energy or luck. On the contrary, they all considered themselves part of a general scheme of things, which included emperors and serfs, popes and heretics, heroes and swashbucklers, rich men, poor men, beggar men, and thieves. They accepted this divine ordinance and asked no questions. In this, of course, they differed radically from the modern people who accepted nothing and who are forever trying to improve their own financial and political situation. To the man and the woman of the 13th century, a world hereafter, a heaven of wonderful delights and a hell of brimstone and suffering, meant something more than empty words or vague theological phrases. It was an actual fact, and the medieval burghers and knights spent the greater part of their time preparing for it. We modern people regard a noble death after a well-spent life with the quiet calm of the ancient Greeks and Romans. After 60 years of work and effort, we go to sleep with the feeling that all will be well. But during the Middle Ages, the King of Terrors, with his grinning skull and his rattling bones, was man's steady companion. He woke his victim up with terrible tunes of his scratchy fiddle, he sat down with them at dinner, he smiled at them from behind trees and shrubs when they took a girl out for a walk. If you had heard nothing but hair-raising yarns about cemeteries and coffins, and fearful diseases when you were very young, instead of listening to the fairy stories of Andersen and Grimm, you too would have lived all your days in a dread of the final hour of a gruesome day of judgment. This is exactly what happened to the children of the Middle Ages. They moved in a world of devils and spooks, and only a few occasional angels. Sometimes their fear of the future filled their souls with humility and piety, but often it influenced them the other way and made them cruel and sentimental. They would first of all murder all the women and children of a captured city, then they would devoutly march to a holy spot, and with their hands gory with the blood of innocent victims, they would pray that a merciful heaven forgive them their sins. Yeah, they would do more than pray. They would weep bitter tears and would confess themselves the most wicked of sinners. But the next day, it would come once more, butcher a camp of saccharine enemies without a spark of mercy in their hearts. Of course, the Crusaders were knights, and they obeyed a somewhat different code of manners from the common men. But in such respects, the common man was just the same as his master. He too resembled a shy horse, easily frightened by a shadow or silly piece of paper, capable of excellent and faithful service, but liable to run away and do terrible damage when his feverish imagination saw a ghost. In judging these good people, however, it is wise to remember the terrible disadvantages under which they lived. They were really barbarians who posed as civilized people. Charlemagne and Otto the Great were called Roman emperors, but they had as little resemblance to the real Roman emperor, say Augustus or Marcus Aurelius, as King Wumba Wumba of the Upper Congo had of the highly educated rulers of Sweden or Denmark. They were savages who lived amidst glorious ruins, but who did not share the benefit of the civilization which their fathers and grandfathers had destroyed. They knew nothing. They were ignorant of almost every fact which a boy of 12 knows today. They were obliged to go one single book for all their information. This was the Bible, but those parts of the Bible which have influenced the history of the human race for the better are those chapters of the New Testament, which teach us the great moral lessons of love, charity, and forgiveness. As a handbook of astronomy, zoology, botany, geometry, and all the other sciences, the venerable book is not entirely reliable. In the 12th century, a second book was added to the medieval library, the great encyclopedia of useful knowledge compiled by Aristotle, the Greek philosopher of the 4th century before Christ. Why the Christian Church should have been willing to accord such high honors to the teachers of Alexander the Great, whereas they condemned all other Greek philosophers on account of their heathenish doctrines. I really do not know, but next to the Bible, Aristotle was recognized as the only reliable teachers whose works could be safely placed in the hands of true Christians. His works had reached Europe in a somewhat roundabout way. They had gone from Greece to Alexandria. They'd then been translated from Greek into the Arabic language by the Mohammedans who conquered Egypt in the 7th century. They had followed the Muslim armies into Spain, and the philosophy of great Stagirite. Aristotle was a native of Stagria in Macedonia, was taught in the Moorish universities of Cordova. The Arabic text was then translated into Latin by the Christian students who had crossed the Pyrenees to get a liberal education, and this much-traveled version of the famous books was at last taught in the different schools of northwestern Europe. It was not very clear, but that made it all the more interesting. With the help of the Bible and Aristotle, the most brilliant men of the Middle Ages are now set to work to explain all things between heaven and earth and their relation to the expressed will of God. These brilliant men, the so-called scholists or schoolmen, were really very intelligent, but they had obtained their information exclusively from books and never from actual observation. If they wanted a lecture on the sturgeon or on caterpillars, they read the Old and New Testaments, and Aristotle, and told their students everything these good books had to say upon the subjects of caterpillars and sturgeons. They did not go out to the nearest river to catch a sturgeon. They did not leave their libraries and repair to the backyard to catch a few caterpillars and look at these animals and study them in their native haunts. Even such famous scholars as Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas did not inquire whether the sturgeons in the land of Palestine and the caterpillars of Macedonia might not have been different from the sturgeons and the caterpillars of Western Europe. When occasionally an exceptionally curious person like Roger Bacon appeared in a council of the learned, and began to experiment with magnifying glasses and funny little telescopes, and actually dragged the sturgeon and the caterpillar into the lecturing room, and proved that they were different from the creatures described by the Old Testament and by Aristotle. The schoolmen shook their dignified heads. Bacon was going too far. When he dared to suggest that an hour of actual observation was worth more than 10 years of Aristotle, and that the works of the famous Greeks might as well have remained untranslated for all the good they had ever done. The scholists went to the police and said, "This man is a danger to the safety of the states. He wants us to study Greek that we may read Aristotle in the original. Should he not be content with our Latin Arabic translation, which has satisfied our faithful people for so many hundred years? Why is he so curious about the insides of fishes and the insides of insects? He's probably a wicked magician trying to upset the established order of things by his black magic." And so well did they place their cause that the frightened guardians of the peace forbade Bacon to write a single word for more than 10 years. When he resumed his studies, he had learned a lesson. He wrote his books in a queer cipher, which made it impossible for his contemporaries to read them, a trick which became common as the Church became more desperate in its attempts to prevent people from asking questions which would lead to doubts and infidelity. This, however, was not done out of any wicked desire to keep people ignorant. The feeling which prompted the heretic hunters of the day really was a very kindly one. They firmly believed, nay, they knew that this life was but the preparation of our real existence in the next world. They felt convinced that too much knowledge made people uncomfortable, filled their minds with dangerous opinions, and led to doubt and hence to perdition. a medieval schoolman who saw one of his pupils stray away from the revealed authority of the Bible and Aristotle, that he might study things for himself, felt as uncomfortable as a loving mother who sees her young child approach a hot stove. She knows that he will burn his little fingers if he is allowed to touch it, and she tries to keep him back. If necessary, she will use force, but she really loves the child, and if we'll only obey her, she will be as good to him as she possibly can be. In the same way, the medieval guardians of people's souls, while they were strict in all matters pertaining to the faiths, slaved day and night to render the greatest possible service to the members of her flock. They held out a helping hand whenever they could, and the society of the day shows the influence of thousands of good men and pious women who tried to make the fate of the average mortal as bearable as possible. A serf was a serf, and his position would never change, but the good lord of the Middle Ages, who allowed the serf to remain a slave all his life, had bestowed an immortal soul upon this humble creature, and therefore he must be protected in his rights that he might live and die as a good Christian. When he grew too old or too weak to work, he must be taken care of by the feudal master for whom he had worked. The serf, therefore, who led a monotonous and dreary life was never haunted by fear of tomorrow. He knew that he was safe, that he could not be thrown out of employment, that he would always have a roof over his head, a leaky roof perhaps, but roof all the same, and that he would always have something to eat. This feeling of stability and of safety was found in all classes of society. In the towns, the merchants and artisans established guilds, which assured every member of a steady income. It did not encourage the ambitious to do better than their neighbors. Too often the guilds gave protection to the slacker who managed to get by. But they established a general feeling of content and assurance among the laboring class, which no longer exists in our day of general competition. The Middle Ages were familiar with the dangers of what we modern people call corners. When a single rich man gets hold of all the available grain, or soap, or pickled herring, and then forces the world to buy from him at his own price, the authorities therefore discouraged wholesale trading and regulated the price at which merchants were allowed to sell their goods. The Middle Ages disliked competition. Why compete and fill the world with hurry and rivalry and a multitude of pushing men when the day of judgment was near at hand, when riches would count for nothing, and when the good serf would enter the golden gates of heaven, while the bad knights was sent to do penance in the deepest pits of inferno? In short, the people of the Middle Ages were asked to surrender part of their liberty of thought and action, that they might enjoy greater safety from poverty on the body and poverty of the soul. And with a very few exceptions, they did not object. They firmly believed that they were mere visitors upon this planet, that they were here to be prepared for a greater and more important life. Deliberately they turned their backs upon a world which was filled with suffering and wickedness and injustice. They pulled down the blinds that the rays of the sun might not distract their attention from that chapter in the Apocalypse, which told them of that heavenly light which was to illuminate their happiness in all eternity. They tried to close their eyes to most of the joys of a world in which they lived, that they might enjoy those which awaited them in the near future. They accepted life as a necessary evil, and welcomed death as the beginning of a glorious day. The Greeks and Romans had never bothered about the future. They had tried to establish their paradise right here upon this earth. They had succeeded in making life extremely pleasant for those of their fellow men who did not happen to be slaves. Then came the other extreme of the Middle Ages, when man built himself a paradise beyond the highest clouds, and turned this world into a vale of tears for high and low, for rich and poor, for the intelligent and the dumb. It was time for the pendulum to swing back in the other direction, as I shall tell you in my next chapter. Medieval trade. How the Crusades once more made the Mediterranean a busy center of trade, and how the cities of the Italian peninsula became the great distributing center for the commerce with Asia and Africa. There were 3 good reasons why the Italian cities should have been the first to regain a position of great importance during the late Middle Ages. The Italian peninsula had been settled by Rome at a very early date. There had been more roads and more towns and more schools than anywhere else in Europe. The barbarians had burned as lustily in Italy as elsewhere, but there had been so much to destroy that more had been able to survive. In the second place, the Pope lived in Italy, and as the head of a vast political machine, which owned land and serfs, and buildings, and forests and rivers, and conducted courts of law, he was in constant receipt of great decay of money. He was of a deal of money. The papal authorities had to be paid in gold and silver, as did the merchants and ship owners of Venice and Genoa. The cows and the eggs and the horses and all the other agricultural products of the north and the west must be changed into actual cash before a debt could be paid in the distant city of Rome. This made Italy the one country where there was a comparative abundance of gold and silver. Finally, during the Crusades, the Italian cities had become the point of embarkation of the Crusades and had profiteered to an almost unbelievable extent. And after the Crusades had come to an end, these same Italian cities remained the distributing centers for those Oriental goods upon which the people of Europe had come to depend during the time they had spent in the Near East. Of these towns, very few were as famous as Venice. Venice was a republic built upon a mud bank. Thither people from the mainland had fled during the invasions of the barbarians in the 4th century. Surrounded on all sides by the sea, they had engaged in a business of salt making. Salt had been very scarce during the Middle Ages, and the price had been high. For hundreds of years, Venice had enjoyed a monopoly of this indispensable table commodity. I say indispensable because people, like sheep, fall ill unless they get in a certain amount of salt in their food. The people used this monopoly to increase the power of their city. At times they had been dared to defy the power of the popes. The town had grown rich and had begun to build ships, which engaged in trade with the Orient. During the Crusades, these ships were used to carry passengers to the Holy Land, and when the passengers could not pay for their tickets in cash, they were obliged to help the Venetians, who were forever increasing their colonies in the Aegean Sea, in Asia Minor, and in Egypt. By the end of the 14th century, the population had grown to 200,000, which made Venice the biggest city of the Middle Ages. The people were without influence upon the government, which was the private affair of a small number of rich merchant families. They elected a senate and a dog or duke, but the actual rulers of the city were the members of the famous Council of Ten, who maintained themselves with the help of a highly organized system of secret servicemen and professional murderers, who kept watch upon all citizens and quietly removed those who might be dangerous to the safety of her high-handed and unscrupulous Committee of Public Safety. The other extreme of government, a democracy of very turbulent habits, was to be found in Florence. This city controlled the main road from northern Europe to Rome, and used the money which had derived from this fortunate economic position to engage in manufacturing. The Florinites tried to follow the example of Athens. Noblemen, priests, and members of the guilds all took part in the discussions of public civic affairs. This led to great civic upheaval. People were forever being divided into political parties, and these parties fought each other with intense bitterness and exiled their enemies and confiscated their possessions as soon as they had gained a victory in the council. After several centuries of this rule by organized mobs, the inevitable happened. A powerful family made itself master of the city and governed the town and the surrounding county after the fashion of the old Greek tyrants. They were called the Medici. The earliest Medici had been physicians. Medics, in Latin for physician, hence their name. But later they had turned banker. Their banks and their pawn shops were to be found in all the more important centers of trade. Even today, our American pawn shops display the 3 golden balls, which were part of a coat of the arms of the mighty house of the Medici, who became rulers of Florence and married their daughters to the kings of France, and were buried in graves worthy of a Roman Caesar. These were Genoa, the great rival of Venice, where the merchants specialized in trade with Tunis and Africa, and the grain depots of the Black Sea. Then there were more than 200 other cities, some large and some small, such a perfect commercial unit. all of them fighting for neighbors and rivals with the undying hatred of neighbors who are depriving each other of fair profits. Once the products of the Orient and Africa have been brought to these distributing centers, they must be prepared for the voyage to the west and the north. Genea carried her goods by water to Marseilles, from where they were reshipped to the cities along the Rhone, which in turn served as the marketplace of northern and western France. Venice used to land a route to northern Europe. This ancient road led across the Brenner Pass, the old gateway for the barbarians who had invaded Italy. Past Innsbruck, the merchandise was carried to Basel. From there it drifted down the Rhine to the North Sea in England, or was taken to Augsburg, where the Fugger family, who were both bankers and manufacturers, and who prospered greatly by shaving the coins with which they paid for workmen, looked after the further distribution to Nuremberg and Leipzig, and the cities of Baltic and Wisby, on the island of Gotland, which looked after the needs of the northern Baltic and dealt directly with the Republic of Novgorod, the old commercial center of Russia, which was destroyed by Ivan the Terrible in the middle of the 16th century. The little cities on the coast of northwestern Europe had an interesting story of their own. The medieval world ate a great deal of fish. There were many fast days, and then people were not permitted to eat meat. For those who lived away from the coast and from the rivers, this meant a diet of eggs or nothing at all. But early in the 13th century, a Dutch fisherman had discovered a way of curing herring so that it could be transported to distant points. The herring fisheries of the North Sea then became of great importance. But sometime during the 13th century, this useful little fish, for reasons of its own, moved from the North Sea to the Baltic, and the cities of that inland sea began to make money. All the world now sailed to the Baltic to catch herring, as that fish could only be caught during a few months each year. The rest of the time it spends in deep water, raising large families of little herrings. The ships would have been idle during the rest of the time unless they had found another occupation. They were then used to carry the wheat of northern and central Russia to southern and western Europe. On the return voyage, they brought spices and silks and carpets, and oriental rugs from Venice and Geneva to Bruges, and Hamburg and Bremen. Out of such simple beginnings there developed an important system of international trade, which reached from the manufacturing cities of Bourges and Ghent, where the almighty guilds fought pitched battles with the kings of France and England, and established a labor tyranny which completely ruined both the employers and the workmen, to the Republic of Novgorod and the northern Russia, which was a mighty city until Tsar Ivan, who distrusted all merchants, took the town and killed 60,000 people in less than a month's time, and reduced the survivors to beggary. That they might protect themselves against pirates and excessive tolls and annoying legislation, the merchants of the north founded a protective league, which was called the Hansa. The Hansa, which had its headquarters in Lubeck, was a voluntary association of more than 100 cities. The association maintained a navy of its own, which patrolled the seas, and fought and defeated the kings of England and Denmark when they dared to interfere with the rights and the privileges of the mighty Hanseatic merchants. I wish that I had more space to tell you some of the wonderful stories of this strange commerce, which was carried on across the high mountains and across the deep seas amid such dangers that every voyage became a glorious adventure. But it would take several volumes, and it cannot be done here. Besides, I hope that I have told you enough about the Middle Ages to make you curious to read more in the excellent books of which I shall give you a list at the end of this volume. The Middle Ages that I have tried to show you have been a period of very slow progress. The people who were in power believed that progress was a very undesirable invention of the evil one and ought to be discouraged, and they happened to occupy the seats of the mighty. It was easy to enforce their will upon the patient serfs and the illiterate knights. Here and there, a few brave souls sometimes ventured forth in the forbidden regions of science, but they fared badly and were considered lucky when they escaped with their lives in a jail sentence of 20 years. In the 12th and 13th centuries, the flood of international commerce swept over Western Europe. As the Nile had swept across the valley of ancient Egypt, it left behind a fertile sediment of prosperity. Prosperity meant leisure hours, and these leisure hours gave both men and women a chance to buy manuscripts and take an interest in literature and art and music. Then once more is the world filled with that divine curiosity which has elevated man from the ranks of those other mammals, who are his distant cousins, but who have remained dumb in the cities of whose growth and development I have told you in my last chapter offered a safe shelter to those brave pioneers who dared to leave the very narrow domain of the established ordering of things. They set to work. They opened the windows of their cloistered and studious cells. A flood of sunlight entered the dusty rooms and showed them the cobwebs which had gathered during the long periods of semi-darkness. They began to clean house. Next they cleaned their gardens. Then they went out into the open fields, outside the crumbling town walls, and said, "This is a good world. We are glad that we live in it." At that moment, the Middle Ages came to an end, and a new world began.